Hello and welcome to Newsline. I'm Arielle Richards.
And I'm Jake Pike. In today's show, we have stories about the dark side of Tinder, an update on Donald Trump's coronavirus case, and we look at some of the vulnerable groups doing it tough under coronavirus restrictions, as well as sports news, today's weather, and finance. But first, today's headlines. Victoria has recorded 15 new coronavirus cases overnight with 0 new deaths. There are now 11 cases with an unknown source of infection. The state's rolling 14-day average is now up to 9.9.
As of today, all Victorians are required to wear a fitted face mask in public. Bandanas and scarves will no longer be accepted under the new rule, and face shields must also be worn with a mask. The fine for not wearing a mask remains at $200. Children under the age of 12, journalists, professional athletes, and those with a medical certificate are still exempted under the rule.
New CSIRO research has found the coronavirus can survive on glass and paper banknotes for up to 28 days. The same amount of virus found on an infected person was tested on surfaces including cotton, paper, stainless steel, and vinyl. Researchers found the virus remained intact on most surfaces for 6 to 7 days, longer than previously believed.
Top Victorian civil servant Chris Eccles is resigning from his role after releasing his mobile phone records to investigators amidst the hotel quarantine inquiry. Mr. Eccles claims he is not behind the decision to hire private security for hotel quarantine and is resigning to avoid distractions in his department.
High-profile bikie and ex-Mongols member Shane Bowden has been killed execution-style in his driveway on Queensland's Gold Coast early this morning. Mr. Bowden illegally entered Queensland last month after fleeing Melbourne, where he was shot in July. It is believed the shooting was perpetrated by members of his former gang.
In Victoria, many parents are celebrating today after 600,000 students returned to classrooms after 10 weeks of remote learning. Metro and VCE students are set to start later this week, and a full return to school for all students is expected on October 26.
A 43-year-old woman has been charged with murder after the man she stabbed on Saturday night in Melbourne's CBD has died in hospital. The stabbing occurred outside of King Street Hotel as part of a larger brawl. It is believed that all parties were known to each other.
A new report shows an increase in people experiencing food insecurity, with people aged 18 to 25 hit the hardest. The report from Food Bank Victoria shows the casual workforce and international students are among new groups experiencing food insecurity. Food Bank Victoria CEO Dave McNamara joins Sophie Raynor later for more on that story.
Now to our first story. A prestigious music theatre scholarship has been cancelled after announcing a list of all-white finalists. The Rob Guest Endowment is accused of systemic racial bias and is promising reform when it returns in 2022. Dom Hennequin with his report.
30 young actors, 30 white faces, and not for the first time.
There 100% is systemic cultural bias in the music theatre industry in Australia.
The Rob Guest Endowment was cancelled in September following an intense backlash surrounding its list of semi-finalists. Just hours after they were announced, organisers were in damage control, releasing a statement many called tone-deaf.
It was pretty much putting the blame on people of colour for not submitting themselves and not taking any accountability or acknowledging the fact that the competition wasn't very welcoming to people of colour.
Reaction on social media was brutal and accusations of systemic racial bias flew.
The panel has always been the best and widest of the Australian music theatre industry.
Once again, I saw performers of colour calling this out for industry leaders to jump on the bandwagon.
After seeking assistance from the MEAA's equity branch, the finalists were planning to skip the event.
Before the endowment pipped them to the post and cancelled it, they were going to boycott.
But organisers beat them to the punch, cancelling this year's endowment out of concern for the finalists, claiming they'd been bullied and intimidated, claims the performers rebuked.
I think it's unfortunate that they got the rug pulled out from underneath them before they could really make a stand, make a statement.
We've almost made these semi-finalists pay for the mistake of the Rob Guest Endowment Award.
Following weeks of negotiation with the Performers Union, organisers are promising changes to the next scholarship, which won't happen now until 2022. They're proposing diversity quotas for the board, judging panels and finalist selections. While some performers of colour are hopeful this will lead to change in the industry, others are sceptical.
They were called out on their lack of diversity multiple times, even as far as 4 years ago, and they made a commitment then and they said, we will do better, but there was nothing that had been done.
And fresh controversy hit the theatre industry last week, with the newly announced cast of Pippin, the first show since theatre shut in Australia, featuring an actor of colour who's been imported from the US. It also stars Carrie-Anne Kennelly, who's previously made controversial comments on race. I'm Dom Hennequin, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
To national news, Katie Johnson joins us now. There's been another court challenge over Melbourne's lockdown. What's the latest, Katie?
Hi Ariel. Well, tensions over the lockdown continue, with a Melbourne hotel owner challenging the restrictions in the High Court. Julian Gurner is lodging a writ in the High Court today, arguing the state's coronavirus measures are harming the economy and denying residents basic freedoms under the Constitution. Gurner owns a hotel and restaurant in the seaside town of Sorrento on the Mornington Peninsula, which has been under stage 4 lockdown since August. Mr. Gurner has engaged top Victorian barrister Brett Walker, who is best known for representing Cardinal George Pell in his successful High Court appeal.
It'll be interesting to see what the result is there. And in other news, Tinder is under fire for facilitating sexual assault. What claims have been made?
So, a joint investigation between Four Corners and Triple J Hack has revealed Tinder's business model opens users up to exploitation by sex offenders. Over 400 people responded to Triple J's public call-out, and the majority said they'd experienced sexual assault or harassment on the app. It was also revealed that of the 48 people who reported a sexual offence to Tinder, only 11 received a response.
So why is the app so prone to being abused by sex offenders?
While Tinder's business model means that perpetrators can use the app's unmatched function to remove all of their information and chat history, this makes it much harder to identify offenders and to prosecute them. Experts from the consumer advocacy group are currently advocating for Tinder to invest in more consumer protections instead of premium app features to deal with this problem. But so far, Tinder hasn't made any changes.
Thanks for that, Katie.
With the bushfire season on the horizon, animal experts are bracing another hit for Victoria's koalas. But a new Koala Hospital being built in Melbourne's west aims to support our national animal through the summers to come. Katie Johnson with the story.
A new Koala Hospital is set to be built at Werribee Open Range Zoo, with funds donated during last summer's bushfires. The $1.84 million hospital is a joint effort between RSPCA and Zoos Victoria to expand the zoo's capacity to care for sick and injured koalas in Victoria's west. It comes after an estimated 30,000 koalas died in the bushfires last summer.
So we've seen huge growth at Werribee Open Range Zoo, over 650% growth in the number of animals being brought in. And so the timing is right now to expand our facilities to make sure that we have the capacity to deal with injured wildlife from the west of Victoria.
The hospital will increase the zoo's capacity to care for koalas, native birds, reptiles and other mammals by up to 400%. $1.3 million of funding was donated by the public during last summer's bushfires, with the rest coming from Zoos Victoria. But while the hospital is a positive development, conservationists say more needs to be done to prevent the disasters that cause koalas the most harm.
We need to take a leading role on the global stage in addressing climate change or global heating, because we are cooking our koalas, or we're changing their food availability as gum trees are affected by climate change, often killed by droughting, obviously by bushfires.
Construction of the hospital is set to commence in early 2021, and a large eucalyptus plantation has already been planted. When completed, zoo visitors will be able to watch koalas being cared for in real time.
We are starting work straight away on this hospital. The need is enormous. And so we think we'll be able to deliver it complete by the end of 2021, making sure that we're ready for the 21-22 bushfire season.
With summer rapidly approaching, Victorians can sleep easier knowing there's more hands on deck to take care of our fuzzy friends. I'm Katie Johnson, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
There's good news for many parents as primary Year 7 and VCE students return to schools today after nearly 2 months of remote learning. Katie Johnson with more on that story.
More than 600,000 kids are returning to face-to-face learning across Melbourne today after 2 months learning from home. South Melbourne Park Primary School Principal Rose Cosentino joins me now. Rose, what was the mood like today as hundreds of kids returned to on-site learning? And what has the impact been on the kids after so many months learning from home, do you think?
Mixed. We had some children who really thrived, and it was like they had their mini tutor, or their one-on-one tutoring where their parents were really quite able to give them the time. We had some children fall behind, and others remain a little bit on track. But it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see now that they're back at school and now they're not being helped by their parents and so forth, is to see actually how much growth they've made. Yeah.
For the rest of the semester?
Look, we're really positive. Look, we've been given guidelines from the Department of Education. We're going to focus on the main, on literacy, numeracy, and making sure children are active. So we've been asked to not worry so much about inquiry, for example, the history, the geography, the sciences, the visual arts, performing arts, even though we're still offering those. But our focus is really catching up children. We're also formulating, we're working out who are the kids that have fallen behind, and we're giving them really a bit of a boost. We have what we call a literacy support person who usually works one-on-one with children, but we're grouping them up into little groups of 4 or 5 and giving them extra tuition, I guess, to really try and catch up these children that have fallen behind.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Rose.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And now we're just going to go to a short break.
As Melburnians transition from a cold winter to a hot summer, a new study reveals an alarming 40% of Australians who rent their home are experiencing energy hardship. The research, conducted by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, recommends policy changes that would help renters make informed choices about where they live.
All newly built Australian homes are required to have an energy efficiency rating of at least 6 out of 10 stars. On average, Australian houses have a 2-star rating. And with no minimum energy efficiency requirements for rental properties, renters are often left out in the cold and the heat.
We have really big windows, mostly west facing. So in summer, they absorb a lot of heat, but also like any time of the year, it's they just let out any heat. So it's really cold in here at the moment.
Lindsay Pettifer rents a room in an old double brick house in Coburg with no insulation.
I'm scared for like being locked in your home in 40-degree heat wave. It's going to be horrendous. And then we have just one really, really, really old air conditioner unit. So it's sort of that balance of, do I pay for comfort and longevity, or do I rent cheaply and cop a hot summer and cop a cold winter, layer up and just deal with that and, have an expensive bill every now and then. COVID's impacting how we all live and probably making us more aware of how unenergy efficient our houses are because we're stuck in them.
Dr. Nicola Villand is a co-author of a new report by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. She says there are affordable and effective changes to rental properties that landlords can make to protect the renters who lease their houses.
So at least if there was some layer of insulation above the ceiling, that would keep a lot of the heat in. Draft proofing, around windows, around doors. So if you can see a little bit of light through, your underneath the door, then it's really drafty and, you're heating your garden. So little things that don't cost the landlord a lot, but provide a lot of benefit for the renter would be really great. But also having some kind of star rating. So for the renter who goes out to look at property, to be able to compare two properties in the same location, maybe same price, but looking at energy efficiency as an additional layer on which to make decisions would really be helpful.
I'm Rosa Ritchie, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
Demand for food relief has risen by 47% during the coronavirus pandemic, according to a new report published today by Foodbank. The charity's Victorian CEO, Dave McNamara, joins reporter Sophie Raynor to tell us what's behind the rising demand.
Dave McNamara, welcome to Newsline.
Thanks, Sophie.
Now, Foodbank's report links the overall rise in demand for food relief to growing numbers of international students and casual workers newly seeking help. What's causing them to seek relief?
Well, I suppose they're not getting any federal assistance at all. So I think overall the whole community is feeling the impact of COVID from a food security perspective, but in particular we're seeing groups like international students and temporary visa holders not getting any financial support, and so they've become, I guess, the tip of the spear of food insecurity across Australia.
And the report had a finding that nearly 1/3 of people had never needed food relief before. Given the federal government's coronavirus supplement payments, are you surprised by that finding?
Well, I'm not overly surprised. I'm very disappointed by it, obviously. And I think what I'm really scared about is what comes now. When we've seen the payments effectively cut from last week, we've already seen a 15% increase in demand since then in orders from our charity partners. And so I can only imagine as we head into Christmas and the new year what that new COVID normal looks like for Victorians in particular. Given most states have been able to rebound from an economic perspective, we're still in lockdown. So those payments have been critical to a lot of people to enable them to put food on the table.
And that, of course, is the coronavirus supplement payment that was added to JobSeeker, which was reduced by $300 last month. How do you think day to day that is going to affect the people who are already relying on food relief?
Oh, look, from a mental health perspective, let alone a physical health perspective, a lot of the people that were already on benefits, we were speaking to them and they were saying for the first time with that supplement, they were able to buy fruit and veg, they were able to buy meat, they were able to pay their bills on time. So I think we all understand the impact meant from a mental health perspective that COVID's having on the most robust of us. But when you add the fact that there's many food insecure people where they've already got underlying mental health problems in dealing with the shame and stigma of not being able to put food on the table, to watch their children not be able to eat a meal, then I think we're really facing a crisis here that just for the sake of a few $100s a week, which could resolve it.
And as a final question for you, Dave, what can be done?
Well, I think those payments demonstrated that if you give people a reasonable amount of support financially, then they can look after themselves, they can put food on the table. So I think even if you want to target those payments, as I said, to Victoria, just to help us through the lockdown period and to the restart of our economy again, then that's going to provide a great mental health benefit and physical health benefit to Victorians as we re-establish ourselves and re-emerge.
Dave McNamara, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Reporter Sophie Raynor there with Food Bank Victoria CEO Dave McNamara. With voting in Victoria in Glen Iris, as his council did not properly consult residents on a divisive, safe cycling path. Sam Mills reports.
Harry Grieve is one of many not happy with Glen Iris City Council's proposal for a bike path on Inkerman Road.
The council as a group had just lost complete touch with people like you and me.
The busy road was chosen late last year as the preferred route for a safe cycling corridor to connect the Jering Trail to the city. This was despite strong opposition from local residents, whose car parks would be replaced with dedicated bike lanes.
Consultation processes, consultation sessions were set up in such a way to deliver a predetermined outcome that suited them.
The anger from the decision still lingers, with vocal opponents like Grieve taking up the opportunity to run in this month's local council elections. But some local residents like Herschel Lunns are sceptical about their plans for the rest of the Camden ward.
And essentially they're running as single policy candidates.
The proposed corridor will start here on the southern side of Caulfield Park and run the length of Inkerman Road to connect at St Kilda Road. But Grieve says there's a better option available to satisfy residents.
The cyclists should be on a dedicated path on Dandenong Road, funded by the state government.
Dandenong Road was one of three options originally canvassed by the council. Along with the nearby Elmer Road, it was ultimately overlooked for Inkerman.
It just it's not going to happen. And besides that, there's physically no room for a bike path in certain parts of Dandenong Road. And also you've got the plantings that make it really impossible for a bike lane to be even considered there.
Independent candidate Jesse Mansfield says the existing cycling infrastructure is not sufficient enough to encourage residents to ditch the car.
It is overwhelmingly on road without physical barriers, and in many instances there is a shared cycling and parking lane.
A dramatic fall in public transport use due to the coronavirus is unlikely to rebound for quite some time, with private transport options preferred. Lunns says provisions, like bike lanes, need to be created for other emerging modes of transport in order to avoid increased car congestion.
You just can't have motor scooters on the footpaths, and they'll be screaming and shouting that they need to have the scooters off the footpaths onto the roadways.
Council are currently in the process of selecting the design of the cycling corridor and then will formalise a draft plan to be released for public consultation. Sam Mills, Newsline.
To international news, Sophie Raynor joining us now. Sophie, a Donald Trump coronavirus update out of the US this morning.
Thanks, Ariel. That's right. US President Donald Trump has announced he'll host a campaign rally in Florida tomorrow, despite not yet testing negative to COVID-19. Mr. Trump said on Sunday he had beaten the virus after his doctor announced the president was no longer a transmission risk. But medical experts say it means Mr. Trump is still testing positive for the virus ahead of the rally on Monday local time. That report comes as the US has reported more than 50,000 new cases of COVID-19 for 3 consecutive days.
And high case numbers too in the UK as it faces what looks to be the start of a second wave of the virus.
That's right. The UK looks set to return to lockdown as Prime Minister Boris Johnson prepares to announce a tiered national system. The PM has briefed his cabinet as coronavirus case numbers continue to rise, warning bars, pubs and restaurants in northern England may close. He'll reveal the plan today, UK time.
And to Belarus, where protests against President Alexander Lukashenko have seen arrest this morning. What can you tell us about that?
Well, 400 protesters and 40 journalists have been arrested as protests stretch into their 10th week. Security forces used water cannons and batons against the demonstrators who are protesting the result of what is widely considered a rigged presidential election in August. Mr. Lukashenko, who has held power since 1994, won that election in a landslide. That's all for international news for now. Back to you, Ariel.
Now here's Sophie Raynor, the latest in sport.
Thanks, Jake. In the States, the LA Lakers have just taken out the championship against Miami Heat in the 6th game of the NBA Finals. Miami put up a good fight, but couldn't get on top of the Lakers, who commanded the match with a 13-point victory. The win secures a 4th championship for star player LeBron James and his first with the LA Lakers. The 4-2 victory brings this year's highly unusual finals season to a close. In footy news, the AFL has announced the entertainment for the first ever Gabba Grand Final. The DMAs, Cubs Sport, Electric Fields and Wolfmother lead singer Andrew Stockdale are set to play at the All-Aussie lineup. And the Bombers' woes continue, with the Crows confirming today star forward Orazio Fantache is keen to return to South Australia next year. The announcement comes after a string of Essendon players, including Joe Danaher and Adam Sard, have pushed to move clubs. In better news for the Bombers, 22-year-old midfielder Andrew McGrath has signed a 2-year contract with Essendon until the end of 2022. Across the sea, the French Open has come to a stunning end, with the Spaniard Rafael Nadal taking out world number 1 Novak Djokovic in straight sets. The 6-love, 6-2, 7-5 win brings Nadal equal to Roger Federer's record of 20 Grand Slam titles. It's Nadal's 13th French Open title. And in other tennis news, Aussies are celebrating Australian wheelchair tennis legend Dylan Alcott today, who took out the title in the quad wheelchair final at Roland Garros. He defeated Britain's Andy Lapthorne 6-2, 6-2. Alcott's win comes after his long fight against discrimination towards wheelchair tennis this year. The sport was initially left off the roster at the recent US Open. Finally, in netball news, West Coast Fever took out Sunshine Coast Lightning yesterday afternoon, placing them into next week's Grand Finals showdown with the Melbourne Vixens. And we'll be back after this break.
It's been a big year for journalism. Like many other industries, journalists have been forced to adapt in new ways in order to accommodate reporting in a pandemic. The second-year RMIT journalism students have put together a list of their top pieces of journalism in 2020, which we will be discussing throughout the week. Today, I'll be joined by Tyler Wright and Joel Cripps to discuss 5 stories of the 25 pieces which were selected. First, Tyler and I will be discussing the New York Times' revelation on Trump's tax returns, This American Life's podcast on the Hong Kong protests, and an insider look into how the New York Times commemorated 100,000 deaths during the coronavirus pandemic. Tyler, tell me about Trump's taxes.
The story here is that Donald Trump reportedly paid only $750 in income taxes in 2016 when he won the election, and another $750 in his first year of the presidency. Here's a little snippet to show how the investigation got underway by the New York Times.
What was interesting about this piece?
So the interesting thing about this piece is that Democrats possibly have no idea that Trump's tax records are sitting in a congressional office building. Because they're under review, they're not shown to other politicians. The investigation has been paused potentially because of the Trump administration, and so there are personal stakes in the upcoming election for Donald Trump.
And what about the Umbrellas Down podcast? What makes it so special?
What was amazing about this story was the variety of views about China's relationship with Hong Kong. One of the producers spoke to Daniel at a boat gathering.
Well, it's interesting because we started with a simple question. It was when, back last year, when 2 or 3 pages of the 2005 tax return were released.
Donald Trump's tax return.
Yeah, Donald Trump's tax returns were released. And we were shocked to see he had made money that year. He'd made around $130 million. And it was just such a juxtaposition from 10 years earlier when the New York Times had published 3 pages of his 1995 tax return, where he had logged $1 billion loss, which would have enabled him to shelter taxable income up to $1 billion for 20 years going forward. And all of a sudden, he has this really large profit. And we just sort of said, what happened?
What was powerful about this piece of audio?
The views about the relationship between Hong Kong and China are so varied, and it just goes to show that some people would rather see the enforcement of law and order than have their free speech and share those opinions with the Hong Kong protesters.
Another story was the New York Times insider piece into how they created the 100,000 deaths front page. What can you tell us about that?
The New York Times scanned through many obituaries and went through many newspapers to find the people who had died as a cause of COVID-19. And one amazing thing about this piece, or the front cover, in fact, was that they included one special, unique piece of information about each person, just going to show the human impact and the lives that these people have left behind.
Thank you, Tyler. These pieces all sound very interesting. We'll take a quick ad break now. Now, Joel and I will be discussing two podcasts. One, a series in which listeners go down the rabbit hole with New York Times reporters as they investigate how the internet works. The second is a particularly intriguing episode from Radiolab, in which we discover what's so special about horse crab's blood. Before we talk about Rabbit Hole, let's hear a bit.
Or like this one night I was at dinner with this guy who was sharing this like very hyperbolic view about something. And I remembered like as he was sharing it, like, I think I read this almost word for word on Twitter today. And I asked him like, is this what you really think? Or is this what you read online? And he kind of paused and was like, I don't know.
So this is really interesting with Rabbit Hole and the way it looks at online advertising, YouTube, Twitter, social media, and all of the algorithms that they use to create these echo chambers, but also how that can be manipulated. We all know the experience of watching one RuPaul's Drag Race video and then suddenly going down a extreme hole of all these different videos popping up, but we all know that this is happening. And this looks at how this can be used to actually change people's opinions as people move from one tiny interest down and down a route until they become part of the far right or the far left and move way beyond where they thought they were. It's really interesting because you wouldn't expect people to be able to be changed that much just by a couple of ads, but this gives some really clear examples of how the internet has changed people.
And what's the best thing about it?
It's actually a really clean and organized podcast because it's from the New York Times. That's sort of what you expect. You expect them to know exactly what they're doing and not really show you too much extra, not show you anything that isn't really contributing to the story. They're making sure it's clear, clean, and concise as much as possible, using sort of best practice journalism in some ways, but also giving you an insight into a really important issue that's affecting all of us every day, every time we turn our computers on. But the people at Radiolab took a slightly different approach.
Have you ever held one, Alexis? Have you ever?
I've never held one in my hands. I would love to hold one in my hand.
Yeah.
Robert, you sound very far away.
I know. Is it this one again?
Yep. So it's strange to sort of peer behind on from Lewis Carroll to Frank L. Baum. We're looking now at going behind the curtain, seeing what journalists are actually doing. So often podcasts and shows just look like they came whole rip. There was no editing. There was no need to change anything. They didn't sort of mess around. But in this clip, we actually see that they have a couple of problems. They stumble through their microphone setup. They look like, well, students and amateurs. And we know that they're better than us in some ways, but also that they have the same issues. And while they're doing really interesting journalism, it's interesting to see how they prepare, particularly for students.
But what about the story? It sounds a little odd.
Well, it is quite odd. It's all about the life of horseshoe crabs. So it started from this image that one of the journalists saw of horseshoe crabs being drained of their blood, and it's a strange blue colour, as a lot of crustaceans are. And it leads down this hole where one of their younger reporters is sent out to a beach to see all of the horse crabs during their mating season, and you see them dead, you see them with holes ripped out of them, but they last for a long time and are able to survive in these conditions. And this blood that they have actually has some medical advantages. Now, when they originally did the story in 2018, it was a little bit shorter, and they republished it with additional information more recently because of COVID, because they've found that there might actually be a use for this blood in fighting other diseases such as COVID-19 or other sort of cases that we haven't tried yet and we haven't had a chance. It goes well in depth into some complex medical issues, and while it initially seems like it might be a bit amateurish, you see 10 minutes in that they know exactly what they're doing and they're in complete control of all of their journalistic skills.
Do you think that podcasts are going to be a major part of journalism in the future?
It's actually quite interesting because we've seen how it's great for investigative podcasts. It's not just these two, it's Umbrellas Down, it's stuff like Trace the Informer, it's all of these different podcasts that they're using to give us long-form investigative journalism that's much more accessible to people than when you had to read it all. because people these days don't really like to read. They tend to prefer to hear things rather than read it. And so it's a really good way for investigative journalism to occur. But it's also been really good for day-to-day journalism. There are so many daily podcasts that exist to give you all of the day's news in half an hour. And now you can do it without even having to open your eyes. You can hear the news and you can take it to work with you. You can listen to it while you're chopping up some vegetables for breakfast or whatever you're doing. And that's a really good way to make it popular. It's also at no cost to the listener, but the problem they'll need to look at in the future is whether this is sustainable to create. They don't cost as much to print as a newspaper, or they don't cost as much to produce as a TV show, but they are still something that's going to be a cost and is mostly free. You see in content like the Age and Sydney Morning Herald's podcast that what they do is they keep using that to advertise subscriptions to their real paper services. They have to use this free service to try and get people onto their paid service. But it also changes the tone. Rather than slightly stuffy, stiff people reading the news at you from a distance being very professional, podcasts give people the opportunity to calm down a bit and talk a little bit more like, well, normal people, you might say. And that's because they're just in a room with a couple of their friends rather than sitting in front of a daunting camera. That's really good for journalism because it's making it more accessible. And I think overall, podcasts look like they're here to stay, as so long as they can make them economically viable. And we've seen attempts with advertising, with additional links to their subscription services, but to see whether it'll actually be economically profitable in the future, that's still a little bit of a stretch, and I really hope they are, because they're a really good way to get news to the people, whether it be about crazy horseshoe crabs or whether it be about something a little bit more dangerous like echo chambers and the internet.
Great. Well, it sounds like something we should all check out. That's all for the stories of 2020 for today. Back to you, Jake.
Apologies for the technical issues. Now we're going on to our next package, which is Queer Nightlife from Christopher Moyer.
The pandemic has hit pubs and clubs hard since it took hold in March, with the latest figures showing more than a quarter of jobs in arts and recreation have been lost in Victoria compared to pre-COVID times. The loss has been felt acutely by Melbourne's queer community.
Diabolical. So pretty much every single thing is on hold. So repayment, savings, everything is stopped.
Jimmy the Queen is a performer with one of Melbourne's largest gay clubs, Poof Doof.
There's no new wigs and new costumes coming in, which is a bit sad.
Since the pandemic began, she's been helping the venue run weekly online live shows to help the community feel together and keep queens in jobs.
And but even then we couldn't really pay proper fees because we were closed.
In Sydney, the picture may look a little brighter.
Oh, good evening and welcome to the Imperial. Is everybody happy?
But with clubs still closed and COVID-safe measures preventing dancing or large crowds, drag queens are still having to rely on government support to get by.
I sort of went from working 4 or 5 nights a week and having lots of corporate events and stuff planned, and everything just slowly started cancelling.
Question number 5 of round number 1.
Fran Giapani runs the Imperial's trivia night on a Wednesday, and while she says being back at work feels great, it's not enough to live off.
I'm not really sure what's going to happen in the future. That is changing. The amount of money we're getting every month is dropping, and work is not really picking up.
With the federal government announcing no further major financial support for the entertainment sector in last week's budget, queer performers are turning to PayPal links, online live streams, and merchandise sales to stay afloat. But with JobSeeker and JobKeeper both decreasing, and pubs and clubs unlikely to return to any kind of normal soon, queer performers have got to be real and ask themselves, is there a life after lockdown? I'm Chris Moyer, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
And now to Elsie Lengi for finance and weather.
Thanks, Ariel. The ASX 200 was subdued at its open today as financial sectors sagged, but has risen again since lunchtime by 0.19%. US stocks finished the week on a high as optimism grew over the prospect of federal fiscal aid. The Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 and Nasdaq have recorded their best week since July, with S&P gaining 30 points and the Nasdaq adding 159 points. The Aussie dollar will get you 72 US cents, 61 euro cents, 55 British pence, and about 76.2 Japanese yen. In the commodities market, gold is stronger this morning, worth around $1,930 an ounce. Brent oil futures are down around 0.9%, and crude oil is also in the red, down around 0.86%. You are now up to date with the latest finance news and to weather from Melbourne and around the country. We've had a mostly sunny day in Melbourne today with some morning fog in the outer suburbs. The city reached a top of 25 degrees. Around the rest of the country, Darwin was sunny today, reaching a max of 35. In Brisbane, it was partly cloudy with a top of 28. Sydney also partly cloudy today and reaching a max of 24. Canberra was 22 degrees with morning cloud and clearing to a mostly sunny afternoon. Across the country, in Perth, it was mostly sunny today, a max of 28. Adelaide was partly cloudy and also 28. And in Hobart, possible showers and 20. For the week, Melbourne is looking cloudy with more rainfall at the end of the week. Tuesday will have drizzle around, 17 degrees. Wednesday will be partly cloudy, 25 degrees. Showers increasing on Thursday with a top of 27 degrees. Showers continuing into Friday, 18 degrees. A rainy weekend as well. Saturday we'll have a shower or two, 20 degrees, and Sunday showers, 16 degrees. That's your Newsline weather. I'm Elsie Lenny, and back to you, Ariel and Jake.
Thanks, Elsie, for those reports. And that concludes today's Newsline program. Thank you so much for joining us. I've been Jake Pike.
And I'm Ariel Richards. Have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.